Hello, welcome to the Gallery Teachers TEFL Masterclass. My name is Ben Crompton, and today we'll be looking at developing top-down and bottom-up reading skills. So here's an overview of what we will be looking at in today's workshop. I'm going to start by introducing what a sort of traditional model for teaching reading might look like, and what some of the drawbacks to that are. And then we'll think about how we read a text. We'll do that from our perspective as teachers, as proficient users of the language. Moving on from that, we'll be able to explore 10 practical approaches that you can use to develop your learners' reading skills. This is all really, really practical stuff that you can use straight away with your learners. At the end, I'll present you instead with an alternative model for teaching reading. Before I start, though, I'd like to talk through some assumptions that I've made about our learners and ourselves. Our learners often lack interest in reading. It's often that skill that learners leave to the end. They're often a lot more interested in developing their speaking skills, their listening, maybe writing comes next. Reading in general English courses isn't something that learners are that fussed about. The reality is, though, that if they're doing some form of assessment, if we are preparing them for assessment, reading is a necessary skill. And in virtually all walks of life where learners have to use English in some capacity, reading skills will be necessary. There's also a motivation factor as well. And you can see that in a lot of our course materials, the texts that come up really don't attack the type of interest and the type of motivations that our learners have for learning. And because of that, there's an inherent difficulty. That difficulty passes over to ourselves as well, because I think for a lot of teachers, we teach reading in the same way, the way that we were taught on our pre-service courses, and yet our learners don't seem to be getting any better. There's also a time consideration. I mean, as teachers, we are overloaded with work, and I'm fully aware that any sort of new approach that I present to you needs to be little tweaks that you make to your classes rather than a big broad stroke new sort of teaching methodology. I'm also assuming that as teachers you have knowledge of exams and assessments. So this isn't a workshop where we'll be looking at the specifics of how reading is assessed in one exam or another. What would a typical sort of traditional reading lesson look like then? It might look like something like this. You've got your teacher on the left in red and what the learner does in blue. It's very much teacher-centered and teacher-led, and it follows that sort of typical pre-reading, during reading, and post-reading stage. And that during reading stage, it really revolves around learners doing some sort of reading comprehension. They read the text, they answer it, they discuss those answers in pairs. You'll find out if they know the answer, and then they do something else. And this is certainly the way that I was taught to teach reading when I did my CELTA. And I'm sure a lot of you can recognize this. The problem with this is that it leads us into a fallacy that we have taught reading, or that our learners have learnt reading, when actually this is a very effective task cycle for practicing reading skills, but it doesn't develop them. It sort of suggests that reading is a passive activity, that simply by reading a text, by looking at the words on the page, our learners are able to get the meaning and internalize it. Now, when I started the action research that really underpins this workshop, I wanted to see what my learners were doing. I wanted to see if they had this approach this idea about reading, or if they were doing more with it. So I went to a group of B1 learners I had. They were preparing for the Cambridge preliminary exam. They'd been doing it for about 4 years, aged 14 to 16, not the strongest class. And I gave them the multiple matching task. So you've got descriptions of people, and you have to match what the people want to one of 8 texts. More or less, this is what my learners were doing. They were pulling out main ideas in the description. They were writing below the letters of the 8 texts, the 8 options, and they were circling and whatever, the letters. But nothing was happening with the text. And when I saw this, I immediately understood what my math teacher in secondary school was going on about when she kept telling me, you need to show your work. I wasn't so much interested in whether G was the answer or not. I wanted to know how my learners were getting there. Now the learners have moved to a stage where they are working much more closely with the text. They're underlining, annotating, making notes, drawing connections, paraphrasing ideas. And it much more closely reflects the sense that reading is a process. There's something going on. And we as teachers need to think about what that is. So let's work on decoding a text. I'm going to present to you a paragraph. We'll do it sentence by sentence, and I'll guide you through some questions about the sentences to help us try and sort of decode what's happening in here as we work with the text. To begin, ask yourself what the bus careered along. So we understand what this verb means, and that there's a noun elided here. It's been taken out, probably road. So the bus careered along the road and ended up in a hedge. Now, does a bus normally career along something and end up somewhere? It doesn't. Where's the road as well? This will depend on the variety of English that you speak. If you speak British English, you might imagine the hedge being in the countryside, and this is a country setting. If you speak American English, maybe we're talking about something that happened in suburbia. But we are assuming that we know what a bus is. We know that a bus doesn't normally do this verb, where this verb normally happens. Let's look at the next sentence. What passengers? Logically, we assume that it's the passengers of the bus. So we understand that this is a paragraph, and therefore these 2 sentences are cohesive, that the subject of the first sentence is somehow connected to the subject of the second. Okay. What about now? We find out more information. The driver was questioned by police. Think in your head, what does that driver look like? And what were they driving? Again, we assume there's some sort of cohesion and that this is connected to the subject of the first sentence. Could be another driver, could be another vehicle. And why was this driver questioned by police? You're now starting to form your own predictions, your own inferences about what's happening. So let's make another prediction. What happens next? What do you think is in the final sentence? Have a read. It probably isn't what you were expecting. Lots of teachers are somewhat surprised by the she Right? We sort of assume that the driver is going to be a man, which says something interesting about our culture. And this breaks our expectations. This shows all the processes going on when we're reading. We are making assumptions. We are connecting sentences together. We are understanding what words and phrases and expressions mean and in what context they're normally used in and how they relate to the subjects and objects in the sentence. There's a lot going on here, and it's probably a lot more than we often think about when we teach reading. I wonder what it feels like for one of our learners to be doing this in a foreign or a second language. I'll see if I can replicate that for you. I'm going to show you the opening paragraph of a BBC Wales News article from last year. Have a read. Can you decide what this is about? There are some things in this paragraph that we can recognize. Mae Palace Buckingham wedi choeddi bod y Frenhines Elizabeth II wedi marw. Bu farw yn dawel yn Balmoral ddydd Iau, meddai'r Palace. We can probably identify who this is and that these two names are related. We're doing this with what's called top-down processing. Top-down processing uses our existing knowledge of the world, of the context, of the topic, and also of the text and the text type to help us form an overall idea of what a text is about. So we know who Elizabeth Dau is, and we know Buckingham y Balmoral. We also know that this is a news article. It's the first paragraph. So it's going to contain the most salient information. But what else? What else can we figure out? Maybe you can identify some lexis. Palace, Frenhines, queen. But there's a lot more going on. We need to recognize and understand the lexis. We need to know the sentence structure, the sentence syntax. We need to be able to understand the grammatical structure and finally the paragraph structure. So there's a lot of linguistic knowledge that we gain from piecing words together into sentences and piecing those sentences together into paragraphs and understanding grammatical features and so on. These two processes, top down and bottom up, they combine. How is this relevant, though, to reading and reading in an exam? Well, back in 2008, Cyril Weir and Hassan Khalifa produced a report on the Cambridge B1 and B2 exams. They looked at reading and they looked at the skills involved in those reading exams. They found that those reading questions in the B1 and B2 exams closely matched the skills needed for reading in real life, which is to say, top down and bottom up. So the assessments that we are preparing our learners for, they mirror the skills that we need as readers in real life. And that means that maybe an approach that just focuses on testing comprehension isn't the most effective for teaching reading skills. This leads us to some decisions. This means that as teachers, we have to make some choices. First of all, if you're the teacher that thinks reading is best served as homework, to allow time in class for speaking and listening or productive skills, perhaps it's time to rethink that. Reading doesn't always have to be done at home and shouldn't always be done at home, especially if our aim is to develop these reading skills. Once we've made that determination that some reading is going to happen in class, we then need to modify our lessons to include elements of reading development, reading skills development. That means probably taking some things out of the lesson and introducing a new activity that focuses on top-down or bottom-up processes, adding between 5, 10, 15 minutes into the lesson to something that helps your learners become more effective, more confident readers. But what can we do? Well, that's why I'm here. I'm now going to talk you through 10 different activities that you can be doing straight away with almost any text to help develop top-down and bottom-up processes with your learners. Let's make a start with top-down. You'll notice when I'm presenting these that we've got the type of process at the top and more or less the time it takes me to do this with my learners. You will notice that the first time you do this with yours, the same way as the first time you do any new activity, it takes a bit longer. When you persevere, when you do it the second time, the third time, you will become more familiar with the task and your learners too. So we're starting by focusing learners on the meaning of a text with narrow questions. I've got here a really short text. It's an Aesop's fable. They're actually very effective at helping learners use narrow questions. What, who, where, when, how, why. Questions that help learners pull out specific information from the text. I probably wouldn't do any pre-teaching of Lexis with this task or with this text, even though it's got quite a lot of complex language for A2 or B1 learners. I'd get them to read through the text, and then I'd ask them some narrow questions. What was crossing the bridge? Where was the bridge? What was under the bridge? What did the dog have in its mouth? Why did the dog let go? How did the dog feel at the end? These questions are very effective for helping learners engage with the text and pull out their own meaning, especially in contexts when they haven't got a teacher to help them. But I know what you're thinking, because there's a myth. I'm going to call it a myth. I'm going to go out there and say, this is a myth about 21st century learners. Problem is, they just don't read anymore, right? That's the problem. Except I'm going to go out there and say that if you believe that the problem is learners can't read because they don't read anymore, I think that's a bit of a cop-out. We need to redress this. Well, for starters, they don't read many of the things that we think reading is. So I might say that reading a Richard Caldwell book is reading, or maybe one of those things on the shelf behind me is reading. For my learners, it's going to be looking at Instagram and reading a post or reading a comment or a tweet. And that isn't a problem, it's a thing. We can address this. We can change this around. They don't read the same things as me, and that's okay. And if we recognize that they are reading different things to what I think reading is, we can attack that. And actually, we can use social media texts with the same narrow questions to really help learners develop those reading skills with short texts that they are familiar with. At some stage, we have got to go into an exam task. What you can do if you've got to work with a long exam text like this from the Cambridge B1 is make it collaborative. So this text has 4 paragraphs. I'd split my learners into groups. So there's 12 in the class, split them into groups of 3. Each group gets 1 paragraph. They read it, and using those narrow questions, they extract meaning from it. And at this stage, they can also ask me for any lexis they don't know. Then, in their groups, the learners write 3 to 4 narrow questions with the answers. Everyone in the group writes the questions and the answers. And then you put the students into new groups. So there'd now be 3 groups. Each group has 1 student from each paragraph, and they do a quick fire quiz, right? They take it in turns to ask everyone in the group their questions. It's a fun and engaging way to get into a text. Obviously, you don't do this with every text you do, but doing it once or twice a term, it's a way of making that exam task a lot more interactive and engaging for the learners. Another feature of top-down processing that's really helpful for learners is building awareness of text structure. So a lot of the texts that they're going to read in an exam context are articles. What is the structure of an article? Well, it's going to have an introduction at the start, 2 main body paragraphs that have the main ideas, and then some sort of concluding paragraph. This becomes especially useful at higher levels, B2s, C1s, or C2s. On the Cambridge test, they've got that nasty task where they have to fit the sentences or the paragraphs in. Well, if you're missing a sentence or a paragraph near the start of a text, well, that's an introduction, isn't it? So you're looking for more general information in the sentences. This text structure awareness can be really useful. It's also useful for thinking about gist reading. And gist reading is one of those skills that we can teach, and we can tell learners, oh, you don't need to read every word, you don't need to understand everything, but they want to read every word. But actually, we want them to just quickly read a text to pull out the meaning, to pull out the key ideas in the text. So we ask them, what are the topic sentences? Topic sentences are like miniature introductions to a paragraph. And they usually come as the first sentence of the paragraph, and they will tell us the theme of that paragraph. If you just read these 4 sentences, you've got a really clear idea what this text is about without needing to go any further into it. Learners can even annotate the text with their own short ideas, their short paraphrases of those topic sentences, to give them a really clear idea of what the overall cohesive argument is. Finally, focusing on top-down, we can get learners to read strategically. This targets something that we do naturally as proficient readers. When we are reading, we will actively make predictions about the text, monitor those predictions as we're reading, reflect on them, and change them. But research shows that this doesn't happen naturally in a language that we're learning. We have to deliberately do it. Our learners won't make that choice, but we can help them. So we ask them to read the topic sentence and predict 3 ideas that they think will appear in that paragraph, along with 3 nouns or 3 verbs. They then read the paragraph, and at the end, they stop reading, they check their predictions, the ideas, the nouns or the verbs, and they reflect. They think about crossing out the things that appeared and adding new ones for what comes next. And they repeat this idea. Something I'm working on at the moment is this idea of having during reading tasks. So they read a paragraph, you stop, you give them a short task based on that paragraph. In the same way that as proficient readers, we would be monitoring what we read, it helps learners to really focus in on what they're reading so that the process of reading becomes less about getting to the end and more about thinking about what's happening in the middle. So we've focused on top-down and processes and activities we can use for this. But what about the bottom-up ones? Isn't it just enough that we focus on those top-down? Well, no, it isn't. Because if we are using an approach for reading that focuses attention on comprehension questions, we focus on the message of the text. And even though those comprehension questions might include some skills using bottom-up processes, if we're not directly drawing learners' attention to them, well, those processes are hidden and there's no development. There's no real skills work that will help the next text become easier for them. So, focusing on bottom-up skills, let's go back to this idea of show your work. It's worth doing a lot of work with your learners on reference words. Referencing is when we use pronouns, for example, to avoid repeating nouns or noun phrases or ideas in a text. So, for example, here we've got it in the second sentence, and that refers back to Green Project. I get my learners to circle the pronoun, circle the referent, the noun, the idea that it's replacing, and to draw the line. So have a look at the text. The word trees in the third line, it has 4 references and 1 ellipsis. Can you find them? Okay, so trees, we've got, if we wanted them, they, ones, they'd, and the ellipsis, they had to be the right type of tree. This is something that will be in every text our learners read, even those texts that they're reading on Instagram or on Twitter or Threads. But they don't naturally draw attention to them. And if you ask them, what does they mean in the text? Probably their initial reaction would be to translate it into their own language. Help them find the connections, find the references. It's really going to help them build an idea about how the text is put together. So we can think about now, what does what? Here we have the verb think. Can you find it? So I'd ask my students to find the verb think in the text. We've got thought. And I need them to write the sentence that this is used in. This is a sentence that contains lots of referencing. And asking learners to decode this and write a full sentence helps them think about the subject, the verb, the object, and how words work together cohesively, coherently in a text to really think about the syntax. So everyone thought it was a great idea. Well, let's decode that. Everyone, so that's all the people in our class, thought planting trees was a great idea. It seems obvious to us, but would it be obvious to your learners? What about collocations and chunks? So collocations are when verbs and nouns, or verbs and adverbs, or adjectives and nouns often come together. Chunks are when we use collocations and expressions in bigger bits of language. And of course, words aren't used in isolation. So we should be encouraging learners to pull out collocations and chunks in any text that they're reading. Look at this one, get. We've got get involved. Get involved in. So get involved in what? Well, in a project, in an event. Get involved in a scheme. Get involved in a program. But go back as well. We should get involved. We ought to get involved. We might get involved. Learners can use this to personalize it. They can use it, the language, in their own way. And they can see that there's a lot more going on than just individual words. What about around? That's a preposition or an adverb, depending on the context, that learners are going to find tricky. And it's hard for us to explain. But if we pull out information from the text, so we've got around a place, or plant some trees around a school, draw a picture of a school on the board, draw a box, school, get a student to come up and say, where are the trees? And they immediately have an idea about what this potentially quite complex word means. Thinking about complex words, we don't often think that connectors are complex, do we? But they are. I've picked out 6 connectors here. The blue ones, well, how are these used in the text? They're used to sequence ideas and to show that these sentences are, again, cohesively and coherently linked. Simple enough. What about that yellow one? What does once mean here? Does it mean at one time? Does it mean after? Or does it mean the first thing in the story? All of these options are plausible. Like once upon a time. Once we'd planted the trees. Once I went to the park. But what does it mean in this context? You can pull out words like this, pull out connectors, and give learners some multiple choice questions that mean that they have to go into the text and decode it to figure out exactly what it means. Does it mean at one time we had planted the trees? That doesn't work. After we had planted the trees? That works. What about and or? So think, does and connect to words or to ideas? Well, it connects to ideas, doesn't it? We all took turns to check the leaves regularly, make sure they had no strange spots or marks on them. But are your learners going to see that it's connecting to ideas, to clauses? Or are your learners going to think that it connects regularly and make? What about or? Does or connect to clauses or to words? It's 2 words. It's spots or marks, not make sure they had no strange spots, marks on them. So and or, right? Very basic connectors, but used in very different ways. And think, when was the last time that you asked your learners what and meant and how it was used? And are you sure they know? Finally, we can think about using graphical organizers. So we looked before at pulling out topic sentences from a text. A graphical organizer is an extension of this, and it helps learners to create their own sort of mind map, their own graphic about how the text works and what the key ideas in the text are. And here's some evidence from my own class of fourth year B1s, pulling out the topic sentence and the key ideas from the text to help them form an idea of how the text works together. So we started with a traditional reading lesson. The teacher says, today we're going to do some reading. Learners discuss those questions. Then we pre-teach the lexis. Then learners read the text, they answer the questions, they discuss their answers, they tell us what the answer is, and then they do something else. So we looked at the start at this traditional reading lesson. And based on what we've explored in this workshop, I can present you with my alternative reading lesson. So it starts off in the same way. I would say that instead of always pre-teaching new lexis, I'd really only do this if learners had something in the text that they absolutely needed in order to read the text successfully. But notice the new addition. I'd be guiding learners through top-down and bottom-up tasks here, an extra 15 or 20 minutes at most, starting with the meaning of the text and top-down processes, and then working with features of the text in bottom-up processes. Then we return to the traditional lesson, introducing or reviewing exam techniques or reading techniques. They do their comprehension task, and then we use the text as a springboard for production. Ultimately, with this alternative approach, I can be confident that I've taught reading skills and that my learners have developed their reading skills. Fundamentally, we want to ask ourselves if our reading lesson or our reading activity is drawing attention to features of the text that we can find in any text. Is our lesson, is that activity helping our learners develop their reading skills? If you take one thing away from this workshop, let it be this question. How does today's teaching make tomorrow's text easier? If you can answer that question, you can be sure that you are developing learners' reading skills. Here are some references and further reading for you if you are interested in developing your skills in teaching reading or in reading further into this fascinating topic. Remember our Pro membership. You can get unlimited access to our TEFL workshops, live events, the safeguarding course, our refresher courses, and join unlimited daily speaking club meetings. Sign up at galleryteachers.com/pro.